They said the French were here to protect Benin. Yet when the gunfire echoed across the border, they stood still. And now, Benin turns, not to Paris, but to Ouagadougou. Why would a nation guarded by Europe's oldest army call upon the sons of revolution? What secret alliance is being forged in the dust of the Sahel tonight? Stay, because this is not just about Benin's fear. It's about Africa's awakening. According to official reports, the Republic of Benin has formally called on Burkina Faso for military assistance against terrorist threats, despite French troops still stationed on its soil. Local sources reveal Beninese soldiers often train without live rounds, sometimes even with wooden rifles. Fear spread across northern villages as militants advanced. But the question remains, why didn't the French move? And why did Benin choose its African brother over its European guardian? Because something deeper than diplomacy is unfolding, something that will shake every border in West Africa. When Benin called for help, the world thought it was a diplomatic whisper. But it was a scream, a desperate cry echoing across the Sahel. The French troops, uniformed and equipped, remained motionless, as if the enemy beyond the border was invisible. Yet to the farmers, to the mothers who fled their villages, that silence was louder than the bombs. It meant one thing: the illusion of protection was over. Burkina Faso answered, not with speeches but with movement. From Ouagadougou to Palma, the volunteers for the defense of the fatherland gathered, carrying not only rifles but conviction. They came from the same soil, the same history, the same fire that once burned in Sankara's eyes. Their message was simple: if France won't defend Africa, Africa will defend itself. The irony was heavy. The French tricolor still waved in Cotonou, yet the orders came from Ouagadougou. The Beninese leadership hesitated, fearing political consequences, but the people didn't. In the markets, in border towns like Kandy and Karimama, whispers turned into prayers: let the brothers from Burkina come. Those prayers were not born from weakness, they were born from awakening. Because in the eyes of the Sahel, the war was never just about territory. It was about dignity. For decades, maps were drawn by those who never touched the red dust of the region. Borders were designed for convenience, not for culture. And now, as blood touched the sand again, the people were redrawing those lines, not with ink, but with sacrifice. The collaboration began quietly. VDP instructors crossed into Benin's northern frontier, showing local guards how to pilot drones, how to detect movements under the moonlight, how to defend without fear. In return, the Beninese shared what little supplies they had: rice, water, and trust. For the first time, the line between nation and neighbor began to blur. And that's when the French command noticed. They saw columns of young men training not under their supervision, but under the shadow of Traore's doctrine: discipline, sovereignty, and solidarity. To them, it was a threat. To Africans, it was liberation. One night, as Beninese soldiers trained with wooden rifles, a VDP commander named Issa handed one of them a real firearm. "You cannot defend your home with wood," he said. "And you cannot build your future with fear." The soldier hesitated, then took it. That moment, captured by a local journalist, spread across the Sahel. It wasn't just an exchange of weapons. It was the passing of belief. From that moment, everything changed. The collaboration deepened, and so did the symbolism. For the first time, an African army trained another African army on the same soil where colonial soldiers once drilled obedience. The message reached even further, beyond the Sahel, into the corridors of power in Accra, Niamey, and Bamako. The Sahel wasn't asking for help anymore. It was teaching resilience. But make no mistake, this was no fairy tale. The French officials began to pressure Cotonou behind closed doors, warning that such cooperation could compromise regional stability. Yet what they truly meant was the loss of control. Because when a people learn to protect themselves, they no longer need protectors. Inside Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore watched carefully. For him, Benin's call was not just a political gesture, it was a signal that the AES alliance's vision was spreading faster than any bullet. He convened his commanders in Ouagadougou, reminding them that every village defended was a chapter in the book of sovereignty. No land in Africa should ever scream for help and be met with silence, he said. Reports soon emerged that the French troops in Benin had operational restrictions. In plain words, they were not allowed to engage. That revelation hit African social media like wildfire. Memes appeared, a soldier sipping coffee under a French flag while an African mother fled in the background. But behind the laughter was rage, the kind that fuels revolutions. Meanwhile, on the ground, Burkina Faso's strategy became a masterclass in community defense. They weren't just sending troops. They were sending structure. They trained Beninese villagers in basic surveillance, emergency medicine, and field communication. The goal was not occupation, it was education. And that made all the difference. Soon, terrorist movements found resistance where they expected fear. Drone strikes guided by joint Benin-Burkina teams forced militants to retreat 30 kilometers north. Back into the wastelands they came from. It wasn't technology alone that defeated them, it was trust. In the old days, Benin might have waited for Paris to approve an operation. Now, approval came from the people. Mothers in the markets sent food to the front lines. Students organized supply drives. Songs emerged on the radio, praising unity, mocking dependency. The tone of a nation was changing. Still, the skeptics remained. How long can they last? Asked analysts from Brussels and Washington. But that question betrayed their blindness. Because this alliance was not built on contracts, it was built on courage. And courage, once ignited, is the hardest thing to destroy. By mid-2025, whispers began in diplomatic circles that Benin might formally request to join the AES bloc. The same bloc that once was mocked as the rebellion of the poor, now represented something powerful, the refusal to kneel. If Benin joined, the balance of West Africa would change forever. At the center of it all stood Traore, calm yet fierce. He never sought to conquer nations, he sought to conquer the fear that divided them. His philosophy echoed across borders: we will stand alone until our brothers stand with us. And now, those brothers were standing. Benin's story is no longer just Benin's. It's the story of every African nation that realized the West's presence didn't guarantee safety, it guaranteed silence. And when silence becomes unbearable, even the smallest nation finds its roar. So when the history books are written, they will not say, Benin asked for help. They will say, Benin remembered who her brothers were. And if you, watching this, believe that solidarity, not subservience, is Africa's true defense, then leave your voice below. Because this movement does not live in speeches or borders. It lives in hearts that refuse to be ruled by fear. In Mali, the dust of Kunba still smelled of gunpowder. A convoy of Malian soldiers had been ambushed by jihadist elements from the Jamaat sect, determined to seize their supplies. But this time, it wasn't the same Mali the world once called fragile. Within minutes, the ambush turned into a trap for the attackers themselves. Infantry units held their ground, waiting for the roar above, the Malian Air Force. The sky cracked open. Drones and aircraft descended, coordinating with ground forces through encrypted channels. What happened next was not luck, it was doctrine. The enemy fled, chased through the forests, and when they reached the ruins of an abandoned village, the order was clear: decapitation strike. The explosion wiped away not just their presence, but the myth that Mali was weak. This battle became a symbol. For the first time in years, an African army fought without the shadow of Western command, and won. Videos from soldiers' helmets circulated online, captioned with a single phrase: sovereignty is not negotiable. Across the Sahel, that message resonated. In Ghana, where lawyers entered courtrooms dressed not in colonial wigs but in vibrant Kent robes, a quiet revolution was taking place. One lawyer said, "When we dress like ourselves, we think like ourselves." It was more than fashion, it was philosophy. Ghana was reminding Africa that sovereignty is also cultural. The mind must be free before the land can be free. The scene felt almost cinematic. Judges sitting beneath the national crest, bright cloths replacing British robes, and in the background, the anthem rising, not of empire, but of identity. A small gesture, yes. But it spoke louder than the marble halls of The Hague. Ghana had joined the AES spirit, not by treaty, but by choice. Meanwhile, Niger was redefining democracy itself. General Abdourahmane Tiani stood before a crowd in Niamey and spoke words that stunned the global press: democracy for us means survival, dignity, and sovereignty. Western analysts mocked it, calling it populism. But to the people who had lived without electricity, water, or peace, those words were liberation. For decades, Niger's uranium lit European cities while its children studied under kerosene lamps. The country had energy, but no light. Dignity, but no respect. When the new government announced plans for a nuclear partnership with Russia, to build power plants for Africa, the world gasped. How can they? Asked the same capitals that once stole their minerals. But Niger's foreign minister answered with calm precision, because for too long, we were the power behind other nations' lights. Now we will light our own. That single statement became a continental proverb. In the markets of Bamako, in the streets of Accra, even in the radio shows of Cotonou, people began repeating it. It was more than energy policy, it was self-respect. And still, the tide of change grew stronger. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the AES alliance, were no longer isolated military regimes as the media labeled them. They had become architects of a new African philosophy, sovereignty through solidarity. Each victory, military or moral, was not just a defense of land, but a lesson to the continent. For years, the narrative of dependency had been drilled into African consciousness. You need us to survive. You need our aid. But in 2025, Africa began to whisper back, no, we needed to remember ourselves. In Bamako, a teacher explained it best. She pointed at a map and said to her students, every inch of this soil carries two histories, the one they wrote for us, and the one we are writing now. The class erupted in applause. Cameras caught the moment, and it spread like wildfire. It wasn't propaganda, it was prophecy. The AES government started to invest not only in weapons, but in people. Mali expanded military engineering schools, Burkina Faso launched local drone production using recycled parts, Niger established youth training centers focused on cybersecurity and energy management. The West called it militarization. Africans called it modernization. Meanwhile, the old guard watched in disbelief. Paris issued warnings. Washington issued sanctions. But sanctions can't freeze ideas. For every restriction imposed, a new partnership emerged, from Russia, from Turkey, from the African continent itself. The geography of power was shifting. Even the cultural frontlines were changing. Artists, poets, filmmakers began crafting new symbols of defiance. In Ouagadougou's film festival, a director's short film titled The Day the Colonizer Fell Silent won Best Picture. Its final scene, an African soldier looking up at a silent French helicopter, drew thunderous applause. The audience understood. Silence was no longer golden. It was guilt. But the West wasn't done. They tried to exploit divisions, whispers of coups, rumors of human rights violations, manipulation through NGOs. Yet this time, Africa had learned. The media no longer held monopoly over truth. AES nations launched their own press networks, raw, unfiltered, unapologetic. They told their stories, not as victims, but as victors. And the people listened. Because for once, the narrative felt like theirs. In Ghana, schoolchildren began reciting poems that ended with, "We are not colonies. We are continents." In Niger, musicians wrote songs titled Electric Liberty. In Mali, murals appeared showing the AES leaders as modern-day guardians, three shadows standing over the Sahel, with the words, "If we fall, the sun falls too." The symbolism mattered. It turned politics into purpose, resistance into religion. Across the continent, even in countries far from the Sahel, small groups began forming, sovereignty clubs. Students gathered to discuss African independence, to share AES news, to dream out loud. What began as a regional alliance was becoming a continental consciousness. And through it all, Traore's influence remained steady, not as a dictator, but as a reminder. He rarely spoke to the international press, but his few words always echoed. Our mission is not to isolate Africa, he said, but to liberate her from isolation. In a world obsessed with power, that sentence redefined it. Power wasn't about who ruled, it was about who refused to kneel. The AES leaders knew the journey ahead was long. The threats would not vanish. But the foundation had been laid, solidarity, identity, and self-determination. And it all started when one country dared to ask for help, not from a colonizer, but from a brother. The chain reaction was unstoppable. Benin's courage inspired Ghana's pride echoed Niger's defiance fueled Mali's strength. And Mali's strength reinforced Burkina Faso's hope. The domino effect of dignity had begun. The Western world may call it rebellion. But in Africa, they call it rebirth. In Paris, the rain fell hard, and the truth finally fell with it. Sébastien Lonou, France's newly appointed prime minister, had resigned, after less than a month in office. His statement was brief: "I choose my country over my party." But everyone knew what it meant. The foundation of France was cracking. Across the Atlantic, the French media tried to contain the damage, calling it political turbulence. But deep inside, it was more than that, it was humiliation. For centuries, France's influence over Africa had been its hidden artery of power. Gold, uranium, oil, and obedience, all flowed through that invisible vein. But now, the blood had stopped. The AES nations, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, had cut the cord. What Paris once called cooperation was now exposed as dependence. And the nightmare had just begun. As factories in France slowed down, and energy bills skyrocketed, whispers emerged in the French parliament: "We underestimated them." The them they spoke of were not enemies. They were former colonies, now architects of their own destiny. Captain Ibrahim Traore watched the events unfold with calm precision. "You cannot build your prosperity on the poverty of others forever," he said during a military inspection. His tone was steady, his eyes unblinking. He wasn't celebrating France's downfall, he was acknowledging Africa's resurrection. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, the streets buzzed with hope. Murals appeared, Traore's portrait beside Sankara's, beneath a slogan that read, "The sons of courage don't ask permission." Children shouted it on their way to school. Musicians remixed it into protest songs. The rhythm of defiance was contagious. Meanwhile, France scrambled for answers. The Ministry of Defense released a statement claiming that French troops remained committed to stability in West Africa. But the footage told a different story. Armored vehicles parked in silence, soldiers lounging idly, locals walking past them without fear. The symbol of control had become a symbol of irrelevance. Back in Paris, economists pointed fingers. The loss of Sahelian partnerships had disrupted supply chains of uranium and rare minerals. Energy companies warned of shortages, while opposition leaders demanded a re-evaluation of African policy. But the irony was poetic: how do you re-evaluate a policy that was never yours to keep? For the first time, African capitals were not waiting for Europe's approval. They were setting the terms. Niger's uranium no longer fueled Parisian lights, it powered African dreams. Mali's gold no longer filled foreign banks, it backed regional reserves. And Burkina Faso's defense spending, now over $1 billion, had become a declaration of faith in itself. The world began to take notice. Russia, Turkey, and even India sought deeper partnerships with the AES bloc. Western media framed it as a pivot to authoritarianism. Africans called it what it truly was: independence. Inside Burkina Faso's command center, a senior officer summarized the moment perfectly: "They used to call us the poorest. Now they call us unpredictable. That's progress." Everyone laughed. But the truth was deadly serious. Predictable nations are easy to control. Free nations are not. And while France mourned its lost empire, Africa built something new: a network of resilience. AES engineers collaborated to design drones powered by solar cells made from local materials. Universities in Mali and Niger launched new programs in agronomy and renewable energy. Burkina Faso's state-owned research lab unveiled its first electron microscope and MRI machine, tools once considered luxuries of the West. When a journalist asked Traore why he prioritized science amid war, he replied, "Because even a soldier must know what he is fighting for." That sentence rippled across classrooms and command posts alike. It captured a truth that foreign powers never understood: sovereignty without knowledge is still captivity. As France sank deeper into crisis, its narrative began to crumble. Old propaganda lines, "Africa needs us," sounded hollow. Social media users in Dakar and Abidjan flipped the script with viral hashtags, #Francine'sAfrica. Memes showed French politicians begging for resources while African leaders declined politely. Humor had become a weapon, and laughter, a form of liberation. Still, the West clung to its arrogance. Commentators on European TV warned that Sahel instability could trigger migration waves. But the reality on the ground told another story. For the first time in decades, young Africans were not looking for boats, they were building bridges. They saw a future worth staying for. The AES charter meetings grew in frequency. Discussions shifted from military strategy to monetary autonomy. Plans for an AES development bank circulated, aimed at replacing the CFA franc with a sovereign digital currency. It wasn't just economics, it was emancipation. At one such meeting, General Goïta of Mali leaned over to Tiani and said, "They colonized our wealth, not our will. The will survived." And in that sentence lay the essence of the Sahel spirit, unbroken, unbent, unbought. But the transformation wasn't without challenges. Sabotage attempts, cyber attacks, and false news campaigns flooded the region. Western intelligence agencies tried to sow distrust among AES partners. Yet, each attempt only strengthened their unity. Because every threat reminded them why they came together in the first place: survival through solidarity. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as the world's second poorest country, had now become the moral center of Africa's fight for sovereignty. Its army, disciplined, modernizing, relentless, symbolized the rebirth of a continent once taught to crawl. The very soil that had absorbed centuries of exploitation was now birthing defiance. Meanwhile, in Paris, silence grew heavier. Former colonial officers spoke in frustration, lamenting that African loyalty no longer exists. But loyalty built on fear is not loyalty, it's slavery. And Africa was done serving in silence. When questioned by a Western journalist about AES's intentions, Traore smiled and said, "We are not anti-West. We are pro-dignity." Those 4 words disarmed even his critics. They were neither defensive nor aggressive. They were inevitable. Because that's what sovereignty really is, not hatred of the past, but ownership of the future. And as the lights dimmed over the Élysée Palace, the lights in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey burned brighter. The map of power was redrawn, not in treaties, but in truth. So when the historians of tomorrow write about this decade, they won't speak of France's fall. They will speak of Africa's return. And if you, watching this, believe that no nation should have to rent its freedom, let your voice be heard. Comment below. Share this story. Because the silence of the oppressed has ended, and the sound of sovereignty has begun. For months, the world believed AES had won through force. They saw drones, tanks, and soldiers and thought it was power. But that was only the surface. The real victory was quieter. It came not from the battlefield, but from the heart of a people who had finally learned to stop asking permission to exist. In every African revolution, there comes a moment when the gun becomes irrelevant, when the spirit alone sustains the struggle. That moment has arrived. In the villages of Burkina Faso, women who once fled the sound of gunfire now lead food cooperatives for soldiers. In Mali, schools reopened in areas once controlled by extremists. In Niger, solar panels flicker on, bringing light to homes that once depended on foreign aid. None of this came from war. It came from awakening. Because AES never truly fought France, nor jihadists, nor the West. The enemy was dependency itself, the idea that freedom needed permission. And when that illusion broke, the war was already won. The twist was hidden in plain sight. The world expected violence, Africa answered with vision. While Western analysts calculated troop numbers, the Sahel built belief. They thought they were witnessing rebellion. They were witnessing rebirth. In a small village near Kaya, an old teacher explained it better than any general could. He said, "The day we stopped fearing the loss of their approval was the day we became unbreakable." His students wrote it on the classroom wall. It became scripture. And that is the paradox that confuses the West, how a region they labeled poor and unstable could find stability without them. But they don't understand what the AES has become. It's not just an alliance of states, it's an alliance of souls. The soldiers of the Sahel now march not for medals, but for meaning. They carry rifles, yes, but they also carry the weight of memory, the pain of history, and the faith that their children will no longer bow to foreign tongues. That is why Traore's silence is more powerful than any speech. When he looks into a camera and says nothing, the world hears a century of defiance. His calm isn't weakness, it's control. He has understood what every liberator eventually learns, that the strongest weapon in any war is conviction. Paris, Washington, Brussels, they all still talk of containment. But you cannot contain consciousness. You cannot sanction dignity. You cannot embargo awakening. And that is the twist the world never saw coming. AES didn't conquer territory, they conquered fear. And once fear dies, no empire can ever rise again. So when the historians of tomorrow ask how 3 nations reshaped a continent, the answer will be simple: they stopped kneeling. And if you, listening now, believe that sovereignty begins not with governments but with people, then this story is yours too. Because the war for freedom has never been about bullets. It's always been about belief. And now, the dawn breaks over a continent reborn. The chains that once held Africa down are nothing but echoes in the sand. From Benin to Bamako. From Niamey to Ouagadougou, a single truth rises with the sun: sovereignty is not given, it is reclaimed. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new rhythm, written not in fear, but in faith. A rhythm that says Africa will rise on her own feet, speak with her own voice, and stand beneath no one's shadow again. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traore moves you, if you believe that freedom is not charity but birthright, then let your heart speak. Like, comment, share, and carry this flame forward. Because the era of silence is over. The age of Africa has begun.